Hi, everyone. I'm so honored and grateful to be here and to present some of my master's thesis work on vocal timbre in Chinese pop music to all of you. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. So I'd like to start with some background on early 20th century China and specifically Shanghai. So the first Opium War resulted in the 1842 Treaty of Nanjing, which forced China to open to the West. And one of the ports designated in that treaty, Shanghai quickly became a thriving home for international commerce and cultural exchange, often nicknamed New York of the Orient or Paris of the East. By 1932, Shanghai boasted a population of over 3 million, including a separate international settlement for foreigners and a bustling entertainment and nightlife scene. During these decades, China also underwent massive political upheaval, including the 1911 revolution, which ended the Qing dynasty and began the Republic of China in 1912, as well as the founding and solidification of key political parties, including the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang. At this time, the Kuomintang controlled China with its capital in Nanjing, led by Chiang Kai-shek. In the 1930s, Japan steadily encroached on Chinese territory, invading Shanghai in 1937 and occupying parts of China throughout the Second Sino-Japanese War until 1945. After the war, the US sent aid to China to combat the rising CCP army, providing both financial support and military presence. However, by the late 40s, the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan, and in 1949, the CCP established the People's Republic of China under the leadership of Mao Zedong. So this very quick and very condensed history is going to provide some crucial context for this genre called shidaiqu, which translates literally to songs of the times. This genre of popular music solidified in the 1930s and is typically credited to composer Li Jinghui, who not only blended Chinese and Western popular music, but also established the Bright Moon Song and Dance Troupe to train and educate children in the performing arts. Many of these young performers went on to successful careers in entertainment. The genre reflects the cosmopolitanism of Shanghai at the time, incorporating Chinese traditional and folk music, jazz, Hollywood film music, and Tin Pan Alley song. While it was exceedingly popular, it also received heavy criticism from Chinese leftists who labeled it yellow music or Huang Yingyue. In media studies scholar Andrew Jones's 2001 book called Yellow Music on this topic, he describes how the coloniality, the association with the West, specifically popular genres, cosmopolitanism, and decadence of yellow music led to the banning of shidaiqu in 1949 when the CCP took power. This idea of yellowness, this decadent sound of shidaiqu really intrigued me. And Sui Chen has this dissertation from 2007 about shidaiqu, where they systematically go through recording, production, consumption, and musical elements of the genre, like instrumentation, harmony, melody, and lyrics. But Chen also includes a section where they discuss the 4 types of singing voices or styles present in shidaiqu. This section includes Chinese traditional, which Chen describes as a Chinese style voice which features brighter head resonance and sharp sounding. Bel canto, which is deep, full, rich, round. Mixed style, which combines the previous 2, and the untrained voice or little sister style, which is nasal, childlike, flat, and thin. Chen also observes that over time, some shidaiqu performers transitioned from the Chinese traditional to the bel canto style, writing that some singers changed the manner in which they sang several years after their first appearance as their voices became more mature or they tried to interpret songs in a different way. And this is their words, not mine. For example, compared to the immature and strident voice and Lovesickness for Sale released in 1937, Yao Li had developed into a warm, rich, and elegant style 10 years later in A Broken Heart recorded in 1948. Like Chen, as I listened to the genre, I did observe that many shidaiqu singers' vocal timbres exhibited a marked shift from this brighter nasal timbre toward a darker and rounder sound, which made me wonder, especially with this timeline, was that darker sound a signal of sonic yellowness? Could a singer's vocal timbre perhaps indicate this yellow aspect of this music, orally representing cosmopolitanism, ideological promiscuity, and decadence? So to visualize this transition while exploring these individual singers' timbral differences, I decided to conduct spectrographic case studies for 5 performers over the course of their careers. So this is more of a qualitative and embodied approach. and that I hope can at least slightly account for the thick cultural implications present in these voices. Here I'm drawing upon work by Nobile and Levengood, mapping their methodology onto Chen's 4 singing styles. And so I started with this sort of binary system of looking at header test resonance, twang or open vocal tract, portamento motion, vibrato, and then bright or dark sound. And then interpreting these results for markedness, and this is either marked for Westernness or marked for Chineseness. And for my performers, I chose the 7 great singing stars who are the most famous Shidaichi vocalists, but I did exclude 2 of them. First, I excluded Bai Guang, who's nicknamed Queen of the Low Voice. Her voice is remarkably deep and slightly raspy, but she didn't have sort of the span of the career as the other vocalists did. So I did exclude her, and I also excluded Li Xianglang, who she did receive formal training from a Russian opera singer when she was young. She was also a Japanese citizen masquerading as a Chinese pop star in propaganda films, which is a whole other fascinating story. So I also excluded her. So the remaining 5 vocalists, now the Wu Da Ge Xing, are Bai Hong, Gong Qiuxia, Wu Yingying, Yao Li, and Zhou Xun. So they were all active from the mid to late 1930s until 1949. And I'll play you these excerpts of about 5 seconds from songs at the beginning, middle, and ends of their careers. And the spectrograms are just the vocal stems in these songs, but you'll hear the whole recording. In Chen's dissertation, he uses Bai Hong as the prime example for each of the singing styles. So I'll start with her. Her stage nickname is literally White Rainbow. And in her 1932 song, Burying Jade, she sings with what Chen calls the Chinese traditional singing style. And then in her 1948 song, Enchanting Lipstick, she sings with what Chen calls the bel canto singing style. So these sound pretty different. And here I've just set up the binary parameters for Chinese traditional versus bel canto. So I looked at spectral centroid ranges, spectral peak, sort of head or test resonance, twang or open vocal tract, and then whether or not there was portamento motion or the regularity of the vibrato. And then my third example from Bai Hong is actually the mixed voice. So we're going back in time a little to 1942 with Goodbye Shasha. This style is interesting because often singers will sing with the Chinese traditional singing style in the higher register and then bel canto in the lower register, or sometimes vice versa. So it is sort of a combination and a blend at the same time. And then for the final singing style, we move now to Zhou Xun, or Golden Voice, and she's probably the most famous of these vocalists. And her 1936 song Express Train exemplifies this little sister style. And obviously we have 4 singing styles, so the binary doesn't really work here. But in terms of markedness, I've sort of marked the little sister style for Chineseness and the mixed style for Westernness. And here I'm just going to go through the rest of the vocalists and their examples, and you can just sort of hear for yourselves what they sound like. This is Zhou Xun's Where Can I Find My Soulmate from 1940 in the mixed style. And then Shanghai Nights in 1946. Sorry for the abrupt endings. And then we'll move to Yao Li, or Silver Voice. And this is she was described earlier in the Chen quote. So this is Love Sickness for Sale. And then in 1942, Dream of Spring. And then in 1948, her song Love That I Can't Have, I actually sort of move away from Chen's descriptors because this to me just sounds remarkably different. So I've called this crooner. So now we have Wu Yingying, who is nicknamed the Queen of the Nasal Voice, which might give you some ideas of what she sounds like. And her 1940 song, I Have a Love, is Chinese traditional, and you can also hear traditional Chinese instruments. Her 1946 song, I Want to Forget You, is actually with the jazz combo. And here I'm again tweaking Chen's categories because she is singing in more of the bel canto singing style, but she's maintaining her nasality, which makes sense because she's the queen of the nasal voice. And her most famous song is Meeting by Chance from 1949, which again, she has that same nasal bel canto style. And then last but not least, we have Gong Qiuxia, nicknamed Big Sister. She was a little bit older than the rest of these singers who were mostly born in like around 1920. And her 1937 song, Roses Blooming Everywhere, I think is more of like a mixed voice, which would be sort of the earliest example. And then her 1942 song, Dream Person, it's hard. She's like the most interesting one because it's so different, but I sort of see her leaning towards that nasal bel canto. And then her 1948 song, Goddess, sort of goes backwards to the more Chinese traditional style. But again, with all of these categories and all of these singers, they are articulating really like their own unique blend and cosmopolitanism. And so all of these are with like tremendous caveats, and also you're only hearing about 5 seconds. So I'm hoping you all listen to these songs separately as well. And to, sort of sum up my analysis, I have this table, which says the song and their singing style, as well as the markedness table. So there is sort of a majority trajectory, right? Most people are going from Chinese traditional or little sister singing style towards bel canto or to a mixed style. But some are sort of resisting that trajectory by maintaining nasality, brightness, and twang in their vocal timbre. Sorry. And I will confess that after I did this analysis, I was sort of at a loss because I sort of assumed, and maybe this was the facile conclusion, that yellowness meant Western markedness, right? That yellow music would be banned because it sounded Western and it sounded popular and it had all these connotations of jazz and, theater music. And then the CCP would obviously ban it because they don't want to have these Western imperial ideologies in their popular music. But also, it's not that simple. And at the same time as this genre was very popular, there was also the rise of mass music. So if you know the March of the Volunteers, which is the national anthem of the PRC, that's an example. And they are also very influenced by Western musical idioms, such as military marches, and they also sort of favor this bel canto sound. The difference, though, between Shidaichu and mass music was just the cultural politics of the sound and the implications of that specific type of blend. So whereas yellowness did not necessarily lie in the bel canto voice, it was this label that was strategically assigned to Shidaichu to serve shifting ideological and political needs. Its association with Western popular music, often perceived as lowbrow genres, as well as its promulgation of Western capitalism through nightlife, entertainment, mass media, and the star-centric music industry, sort of prompted its yellowness. And then increasing alignment of the vocal timbre with Western popular styles, such as Yao Li's crooning, could merely confirm this linkage. And then conversely, when Shidaichi vocal timbre aligned with more traditional singing styles, it could also imply a commitment to the past and this cross-fertilization of the old with the modern world, which the CCP may have also viewed as dangerous. Yellowness, then, cannot explicitly be read on a spectrogram or heard in vocal timbre, but instead arises from a political reading of the voice, a strategic semiotic promiscuity allying both with Western popular entertainment and with tradition. And both of these examples represented ideological danger, and that led to the banning of Shidaichu in 1949. Sorry, I need to skip through some of these. And practitioners of Shidaichu fled to Hong Kong and Taiwan at this time, and remaining musicians were persecuted. And in fact, Li Jinghui was executed in 1968 during the Cultural Revolution. To conclude, these members of the Seven Great Singing Stars performed during an exceptionally tumultuous and uncertain era in Chinese history. Their voices represent individual spotlights on the complex web of relationships between coloniality, modernity, political ideologies, and popular entertainment in Shanghai. As performers, they chose to articulate their adherence to or dissimilarity from Western popular styles, fashioning and refashioning their voices from year to year in an effort to navigate an ever-changing cultural and political climate while retaining their unique personal sound. Through this analysis, I demonstrate the variance in their voices and their strategic modulations in response to local and global conflicts. Though I pinpoint certain aspects of their vocal timbres that I initially thought signaled a yellow or decadent sound, I argue that the simultaneous alignment of vocal timbres in Shidaiju with both Chinese traditional and Western popular music imparted ideological danger and invited subsequent censorship. With this diversity in Shidaiju vocal timbre, I find that yellowness instead acted as a convenient and politically charged label for a sonic moving target, a practice that continued during the Mao regime and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. We again have some time for questions. Many questions.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you, Annie, for your presentation. Yeah, thank you for sharing so beautiful song. So as for a Chinese, I have some question about the background of this, because as you in your explanation, you mentioned that at that time the country banned this kind of yellow sound because of its mixed with like Western style. But as far as I know from the history is people really love this sound because it mixed with different styles. But the government banned it because of the meaning of that, like they talking about love and I want you, I something. But at that time, the history of China, people are more like more enclosed, that they wanted to talk about aloud about love, I want you or something. So that make them feel like feeling of yellow or feeling of not very upper level at that time. And also because that was after the war, so they want people to get prepared for construct our new homeland. So if you like into the loving and so on, so that will make them feel like, no, you cannot do this. You should prepare for the constructing new world, not into this love songs. So it's more like they have a historical context of that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. It's so interesting. Yeah, so I have a question and some comments. It's also related to what Yifan said, because I was wondering about the lyrics, because a lot of the yellowness could be related to the lyrics. And the other thing I'm also wondering is because they have like in the early 20th century, there is a huge tradition of, they want to learn new music from the West, and they took a lot of melodies of the West and they rewrote their own lyrics to the same music.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how much of it is a change in the lyrics, how much of it is them inputting their own ideals about aesthetics of the voice to make it their own, and so that it's not another piece of music taken from someone else. And then a comment that I find very interesting is also, I wonder how much of it has got to do with aesthetics of or what they desire in recording. So how much of it is also the recording person's desires of a certain kind of sound? Right.
Yes.
So
yeah. Okay. So lyrics, yeah. So yeah, there are differences in the lyrics. And so here I'm really just looking at the voice itself. But yeah, I think Chen talks about lyrics a lot, and there is, yeah, the idea of the individual in the lyrics a lot, and like romance and having fun and having a good time, which is very different from the mass music of this time. So I would say that that is a big part of yellowness, but I was wondering if there was sort of like a sonic yellowness. And then, yeah, I think right now I looked at the performers, like I did want to give the performers that element of agency, right? That they were constructing what they wanted their voice to sound like. But of course there's composers involved. There's a lot of these were in films. So There's music directors of films involved. There's recording artists. There's so many layers upon layers in this. And in this case, I really just looked at the performers, a lot of whom were not even formally trained, who some of them went into that song and dance troops. So there's countless influences here. And then what was your comment? I'm sorry.
More about looking at the recording side of it and how much was it related to the constraints of the technology that was available, and how much of it was also the recording engineers' desires for a certain kind of sound, and also the audience, because if audience wanted this, then to be commercially successful, they have to do this.
Yeah. And again, like there's just this huge web of factors. And also you have to take into account that between 1937 and 1945, a lot of these performers were also in Japanese propaganda films. And so there was sort of like the Japanese sort of, influence as well in what this sounded like. Yeah.
I think it's a huge, interesting topic.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Annie, for all of this and the whirlwind introduction to this really interesting music. One of the things that I noticed in the way that you sort of categorize things as either Western or Chinese is that the orchestrations in the Chinese examples often have an instrument, usually a bright string, doubling the vocalist. And I'm curious how much orchestration plays a role in yellowness versus non-yellowness.
Yeah. And again, I was trying to isolate the voice, but in this genre, there's often a soprano instrument doubling the voice. So especially in early examples, it would be, a trumpet or a clarinet or the right hand of the piano or a string instrument. So I think, and again, this genre is just so multifaceted. There's constantly mixing of traditional Chinese instruments with jazz like traditional jazz, like ensemble type instruments. And so I do think it depends. And for Wu Yingying, I kind of hear her like when she's playing with a more bright timbred instrument, she matches it. And then when she's with more jazz instruments, she might modulate a little bit. But yeah, I was not really looking at instruments. Again, this is just a small slice, but yeah, I was focusing primarily on the voice, but definitely orchestration plays a role.
Thank you for being here. I'm Francesco Maccarini from Université de Lille, and I'm going to present my framework for computer-assisted orchestration. So, to be clear, what we are trying to model is the rewriting a piece that exists for the orchestra. So, for example, the input of our process would be a piano score, and the output a full orchestra score. To do that, we want to have interaction between human agents and algorithmic agents. So we developed a process in 3 steps, passing through 2 intermediate objects, which we call layer score and orchestration plan. All right, so the plan for the presentation is I will go through the 3 steps of this process. Then I will present a project in which we actually applied this to orchestrate a piece, and then conclude with some perspectives on the topic. So the first step of our process is to write a layer score. Wow, what is it? I think it's better explained through an example, so I will show the example. Here we have the beginning of Mozart Symphony number 40 in 2 versions. So one is the original on the top, and on the bottom, you have a piano reduction by Huang. I can play them, and then we can discuss. Here. Sorry. Stop this, I guess. Yes. So basically, there are many differences between the 2 versions, mainly because of the constraints of the piano, which must be played by two hands by one person, and the orchestra, which is played by many musicians, and the instruments are different characteristics. But nevertheless, there are things in common between the two versions, and we can recognize them to be the same music. So what are those things in common? If we take those things in common, we can build what we call a layer score, which is an abstract version of the piece in which there are the notes on the composition that are divided into streams or layers, which have a role in the composition. So we can either interpret this layer score as a common ancestor of all the possible versions of a piece, of a composition, or as something in between an orchestral score and a piano score. Indeed, in the orchestral score on the top, the layers are expanded to all the stubs of the different instruments of the orchestra. Instead, in the piano score, they are condensed to fit on two hands. The layer score is built so that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the perceptual streams and which are those layers and the stubs. So the first step of the framework is to analyze a piano score, to make a segmentation of the piece, and to identify all the layers, and to build a layer score. Once we have a layer score, we need to pass from it to a full orchestral score. And for that, we need an object that maps layers to instruments. This is what we call orchestration plan. And I will show how we have structured it. So for every layer in the layer score, we need a layer instrumentation, which is basically a list of the instruments that are playing the layer. So here we have a melodic layer, the red one, which will be assigned to violin 1 and 2, the oscillation layer, which is assigned to violas, and the sparse layer in yellow, this is assigned to cello and contrabass. This is for one segment of the piece. So the piece, we said that is segmented into different segments. And for every segment, we need to provide a segment instrumentation. This is this object. So the collection of all the layers instrumentations that for the layers appearing in this segment. This would be the segment instrumentation for segment 1. And the orchestration plan would be the collection of all the segment instrumentations for all the segments of the piece. So at the end of the second step, we have the layer score and the orchestration plan. So we are ready for the third and last step, which is to build, to write, and to perform the orchestral score. The layer score and the orchestration plan are combined to create the orchestral score. There are still some technical and artistic choices to be made, and those can be taken, for example, by an artist that is using the system. So this is how the whole framework looks overall. It must not be thought as a linear process, even though I explain it a bit like this. There are feedback processes, feedback loops that are allowed. So for example, when we encounter problems in writing the final orchestral score, we can go back to the layer score or to the orchestration plans to fix some errors and to fix these problems. So all these objects that I explained can be formalized with a in a mathematical framework. If you want to know more about it, you can discuss it during the break. So let's move to what I think is maybe the most interesting part for today is the project of co-creativity using this framework. For this, I collaborated with Mael Udan, who I met through Arthur, and well, I thank his contribution. It was very important, both artistically and scientifically, to go from these ideas to something that is really, can be really applied in a real project. So this project started on 15th of March 2023, when Giselle Velarde, who is an AI researcher, but also composer, contacted us to create orchestrations of some of her pieces. She wanted to do it using AI. So these are how the pieces sounded like. Okay. So, oh, sorry. Here, what you have heard are the two excerpts from the original version for piano solo, and we took these pieces through our framework. In this project, we ended up using a computational model only in the second step of the process, while the creation of the layer score and the final combination has been done by hand. So I will jump directly to the model that we used for generating orchestration plans. It's a Markov model, a probabilistic model that has some states which are sampled from a probability distribution that depends on the previous state of the system. It's quite simple, but it contains already many of the parameters that are usually taken into account when performing traditional orchestration. One of these parameters, the first one, are the instrument's acoustic weights. These are just some numbers that represents the loudness of each instrumental section. And then we have these possible layers instrumentations, which are presets for layers instrumentation for different layer types. So I will explain a bit better through this example. For a layer, a rhythmic layer of type 1, we could have the instrumentation through two alternatives, for example, one with woodwinds, one with brass. One of the two has to be selected. So in case the first one is selected, then the flute has 0.3 probability of appearing, oboe 0.1, and so on. We can distinguish also between these two thanks to the expected loudness of these objects, which is the weighted sum of the acoustic powers of the instruments weighted by their probability of appearance, which are here. We can see different before these two. So the user of the system must provide a target loudness profile, which is the curve that you see here, for every segment of the piece. And the system will try to match to this target loudness profile. How does it do it? So here we get into the technical parts. In every segment of the piece, for every layer, the system samples which alternative has to be taken based on the same the same layer, the condition of the same layer at the segment that is coming out just before. Sorry. So there is a transition tables with weights for this, and moreover there is another penalization coefficient, which is the cost of loudness mismatch, which basically is favoring those alternatives that have closer expected loudness to the target loudness provided by the user. So at the end, here it would be this first one, the closest one, and the one that is chosen with higher probability with respect to this one, even if from the standard transition weights, the other one has higher weights, but the combination of the two is what gives the result. So at the end, the orchestration plan looks like something like this, which is a proposal of layer instrumentation for every segment of the piece. We have, moreover, three levels of relative loudness with which the orchestrator can play at the end to do his selection. We output a lot of these orchestration plans, and we let the artist, the human artist, go through them and decide which one fits better to his taste and also the feasibility of the project. So the pieces were then performed on 19th of July, 2023 by an Orchestra Kronos. It's an amateur orchestra. You will see a recording now, in La Paz, in Bolivia. So recording. How do I go full screen here? I don't know. What? I will jump to the performance. For the other piece. All right. So, conclusions. This is how we applied this framework to this specific project. So with a lot of interaction between the humans and the algorithm in the second step of the creation of the orchestration plan. And to go to the perspectives. So we have tried to do this last step automatically with a large language model. We thought that this kind of model could have enough freedom to rewrite the nodes that are found in the layers core for the specific instrument. So respecting the patterns that are usually found in this instrument and the characteristic of these instruments. What we ended up with is a system that instead is too free and is improvising too much on the things that we provide. So I think that for this last step now, I'm going more towards a procedural method, which will still require a lot of manual revision at the end, but which can give a score ready to be edited. And we still plan on implementing, on using large language models, but something more like a Berta classification model to improve on the generation of the orchestration plans. So that's it from me. I can answer questions now.
Thanks so much, Francesco. Questions?
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. I'm wondering if you envision this to be a time-saving thing for composers for more efficient orchestration practices, or if it's more of an exploratory, investigative perspective.
Yeah, I think both. When we started this project, we had more in mind the idea of automating things. We started with the idea of envisioning the film industry for all of this. So where they are writing a lot of this music, which is tonal mostly, and which has this still this layer structure, so we started thinking about this. Then for now, it's an exploratory thing, and it's still very experimental. But the final goal would be to target at the film industry. Thanks. Where many people also are interacting on the same composition, which is also a thing. So to have a structure, because many people and many systems need to interact.
Thank you, Francesco. I'm curious about you analyze things by segments. But then how do you ensure, do you have algorithms that ensure sort of continuity of the orchestra plan between segments? Because some of the other frameworks that have been used for automatic orchestration don't have this notion of continuity, voice leading, if you want, that allows for certain patterns or layers, whatever, to be continuous or transforming in some systematic way from across different instruments. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so in our framework, segments they are not as short as a bar. It's something that is like spanning, I don't know, 2, 3, 4. It depends on the context, but they are more similar to formal sections of the piece than to a short context window. So the idea is that inside of the segment, there is this coherence, and to connect to one segment to the other the model has these presets. So it will sample from these probabilities distribution that are given and are learned so that when it can be that there is a continuity or it can be that there is a discontinuity, but it's clear that there are these two notions, continuity or timbral discontinuities, change of everything, yes.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Do you have any experience with more convoluted type of music as a starting material, something that is less idiomatic, like Schoenberg, for instance, or free jazz? How is the output?
Yeah, no, indeed, I have to admit that no, we targeted this kind of music, this specific style. Let's say we started really from classical symphonies in the analysis and everything. So I believe that, well, there are possibilities to adapt this thing, but there is a huge work to do if we want to go to other styles, yes.
I think I'm going to use my prerogative as the microphone holder here to take the last question, but I was curious about analysis and if you've thought much about how to develop those orchestration plans based on existing repertoire, for example. Can you say Mozart often puts the oscillation layer or the melody layer in these instruments, transitioning to these instruments? So is there a analytical kind of corpus study, or could you envision such a thing happening?
Well, we have a corpus that we have published with first movements of classical symphonies that are analyzed. And well, that is the corpus on which we have based all of our ideas, let's say. So there are layers that are analyzed with this, our taxonomy for rows and what these things are, yes.
Okay, fantastic. I think we have to move on. Thank you so much, Francesco.
Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and from this part of the world. And I'm happy to be here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come in person due to visa issues. Today, I want to talk about the intersection of timbre and structure in Nigerian music, with my focus being on the Igbo music titled Akwunechenyi. My engagement with this music started by a story, kind of a tragic story for the teller of the story, who was a member of this ensemble. And he narrated to me how he had a tragic experience about when his drum was broken on their trip to a performance, and there was no time for him to get a new drum. So he had to borrow a drum from another instrumentalist who they found at the venue. He could play with his ensemble, but according to him, it was such a horrible performance because even though he could play all the techniques that he was supposed to play, the ensemble actually considered what he played as not fitting into the ensemble structure. So this actually led me to start thinking around if this was the case in terms of the drum being there and the performer being an expert in the music, what was it that actually informed the rejection per se of his performance by his colleagues in the group? And I started now, it's still a preliminary research, but I'm starting to engage with the musicians and in terms of interview and to analyze the music, to understand how it is that timbre or the timbre of the instruments actually informs the structuring of the music. So in many African Igbo traditional, Nigerian Igbo traditional music, because the instruments used in these genres do not produce specific sounds, their functionality in orchestral context is most of the times understood as rhythmic. And with such an understanding, the organization of instrumental timbres that characterize this music risks being overlooked or misinterpreted as primarily rhythmic in nature. In this presentation, I want to argue that the basic function of the instrumental part in Igbo music is not rhythm. Rather, it is a timbral extension. It is a timbral extension of the vocal lines. And I'm going to play you this video because it was a video analysis of the music which McKinsey made in his book, Musical Sense and Meaning, where he interpreted the timbral resonances of the drum. But one little critique I have about the analysis is that the focus was on the drum because the drum is tuned, but there are other supportive instruments, as he described it, that he did not consider. And these other supporting instruments actually are the primary instruments in the music ensemble I want to discuss. So here is my audio coming out?
Your audio, you may have to exit the screen share and restart it with the sound.
Files. How do I share sound? Okay, yeah.
Your box in the screen share dialog that you can check the sound.
I think it's okay now. Okay, so is it coming?
Oh yeah, we're seeing that the volume on your video may be turned down. Is that possible?
No.
To the right of the player? No? You mean the volume on the player itself, to the right of the bar where the thing is? Is that the volume muted near the bottom? There.
So I want to argue that the basic function of the instrumental part in Igbo music is not rhythm, but rather it is a timbral extension of the vocal lines. And I'm going to present an analysis of a section of the Akunechenyi music performance and a few lines from the interviews I had with the performers of this genre. Akunechenyi literally translates to togetherness, that is unity, is the security of the elephants. But the elephant is not really the focus here. It is a metaphor that encourages unity amongst the Igbo society members. And the music is open to everybody as long as the person is a male indigene of the society and not a child. It involves what Nzewi describes as spirit manifest, which many people describe as masquerades. But the masquerade part or the spirit manifest part is optional. It is also communal and encourages audience participation. Of course, we have specific people who perform this music as the instrumentalist or the performers of the music, but the audience and the members of the society are encouraged to join in the performance and participate in any way or shape or form they can. So here is the spirit manifest or the masquerade that some might describe it of the Akunechenyi ensemble. The Igbo language and many languages in Africa is tonal, which means that the inflections of the words determine the meaning of such words. Akunechenyi melody is influenced or modeled after the spoken Igbo words. And the melodic contour adheres to the tonal inflections of the underlying lyrics. So here is a transcription of the chorus section of the genre and how the tonal inflections of the underlying lyrics actually influence the melodic contour. The melody in the previous slide is sung in unison, and it is based on the 4 notes I'm showing here in the slide. However, the lead vocalist extends the range of the melody through his performance composition. Performance composition is a term that Nzewi has coined to describe what many researchers have described as improvisation in African music. Nzewi argues that what happens during a performance in African traditional music is not really improvisation, but the composer performers or the modern musician, as he describes them, actually are presenting a remodeling and an extension of an existing model within a certain context and contingencies that determine how that model develops in performance. So here is a transcription of the solo part. So if we add the lines of the soloist and the chorus, the notes or the melodic range now increases from 4 notes to 9 notes. And it is these 9 notes that both the voices and the instrumentalists explore. To the orchestration, because the vocal lines are mostly performed either as solo or unison, it is dependent on the instrumentalists to provide a harmonic background using instrumental timbres. This timbral conception of the orchestration can easily, as I have said, be misrepresented by a listener as rhythmic accompaniment, in which I argue that this is not the case. This is the list of the instruments that perform in this excerpt I've played for you. The shakers I have abbreviated as SHK, twin gong as TGNG, and woodblock and big gong and membrane drums. So here I have a representation of the approximation of the notes which each of the instruments actually play when they perform or when they produce timbral extension of the vocal lines. The selection and the tuning of the orchestral instruments reinforce specific tones in the melody, and in many cases actually extend the melody to involve other notes that form part of the overall spectrum of the music. I will explore this a little bit later. So from the previous example, and having collected all the pitches or all the sounds from the instruments, I had to analyze it using SPARE, and this is the harmonic spectrum the analysis actually produced on SPARE. And from the analysis, it is evident that the instrumental section explores the B-flat spectra approximately. I'm going to show this in the next slide. The instruments do not produce specific pitches, hence what I'm presenting here is a kind of an approximation to the closest semitones, so that it gives a clearer understanding of the tones or the timbres of the instruments in terms of tones, semitones. So far, I have presented that the selection and the tuning of instruments in Akunechenyi explores the pitch organization in the melody. And the melody is derived from the tonal inflections of the underlying lyrics. In a discussion with the instrumentalists about how this timbral sequencing or timbral organization is achieved, they described three main areas that guide the organization of the instrumental section. The first they describe as nuku, oda nuku. The second is the oda etiti. And the third is oda obere. Oda nuku means a big sound. Oda etiti translates into intermediate sound, and the oda obere as the small sound. These three sounds are represented with these three different sizes of the triangle. So here is a transcription of just 4 bars of the instrumental section to illustrate how the instrumental timbres or the instruments combine to support this argument of big, intermediate, and small sounds. I'm going to play you just these 4 bars. So there are 3 main points I've marked out that connect the different instrumental timbres, the A, B, and C points. The combination of the 3 points marks the beginning of a phrase and also the end of another phrase. So from point C to point, let's say from point A to point C, point A becomes the end of a musical phrase and also the beginning of another phrase when the instrumentation actually moves cyclically. So here I've tabulated all the instruments according to these 3 points and how many instruments are actually playing at each point of the composition of the performance to determine how these combinations reinforce the argument of big sound, intermediate sound, and small sound. So at point A, we have the shakers, 2 shakers or 3 shakers, shakers 1 and shakers 2, the twin gong, the membrane drum 1 and the membrane drum 3. At point B, we have 5 instruments, and at point C, we have 6 instruments at the point, 7 instruments with the membrane drum 2 playing the deeper tone of the instrument. So I describe A as the big, B as the small, and the C as the medium. And the sequences of these timbres, as we will see in the next slides, determine how a listener perceives the orchestration. Diagrammatically, I am representing this cyclic structure from point A back to point A again, using 3 colors, black, gray, and light blue. So the black represents the rich spectrum, and the B part is the light spectrum, while the C is the moderately rich spectrum. I also analyzed a section of this instrumentation using a spectrogram, and this is the outcome of the analysis. So the point A, which is the big sound we can see here, and then the point C, which is the intermediate sound, and point B, which is the small sound, according to the instrumentalists. Point A corresponds with the pulse of the music, or at some point we can describe this as a strong beat, but the pulse of the music corresponds with point A, which marks the end of the phrase and the beginning of another phrase. The most resonant instrument, that is the big or the biggest membrane drum at this point, performs at point A. And this reinforces the big sound idea of the instrumentalists. The big drum reinforces the fundamental, which is approximately B flat, tone of the spectra. At point B, the spectrum is the weakest, because it embodies the mostly light instruments such as the woodblock, the shakers, and the rattles. The big membrane drum or the biggest membrane drum actually does not play at this point, perform at this point. B serves as a preparation for the arrival of a bigger spectrum, at C, which eventually will lead back into the biggest sound of the cycle. So I'm returning back to the table where I presented the number of instruments that are performing at any point. So if we look at point A, we find out that even though there are fewer instruments, the instruments that are playing, the membrane drum, which is membrane drum 3, is the biggest, and it only plays at point A to reinforce that here is the biggest part of the sonic cycle. Although the greatest number of instruments play and perform at point C, the fundamental tone is not present, as I've said. And this actually reinforces the argument of the instrumentalist that the sound has to move from the big into the small and then into the medium sound. I hope from this presentation I've been able to substantiate that the instrumental part of Akwecenyi and most Igbo instrumental music is not fundamentally rhythmic. However, it is a timbral extension of the vocal lines by the instrumentalists. And these sequences of the timbre determines the structuring of the instrumental part. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Chidi. We're running a little behind schedule because of the technical issues, but we can still take our 5 minutes for questions, I think. I see a hand over here.
Hi, Chidi. I don't know if you could see, but Jason Winikoff here. Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. And I'm so happy to see the direction this research is taking. Super important. So I was struck by the fact that so many times you interacted with Meki and Zoe's great work. But I noticed that you didn't mention his concept of mellow rhythm or his EUT, his ensemble unilineal theme. And seeing how those two concepts of his are so much in line with what you're saying, they're basically looking at these various kinds of music as orchestrated sequences, as timbre rhythms with melodic and not really secondarily rhythmic function. I'm just curious how some of his concepts intersect with the points and arguments you were trying to make.
Very much so, because of time, I kind of was very selective in terms of what I say and what I do not say. And his concept of melorhythm is really critical to my thinking and my research at this point, although I'm not very sure whether it will still be as strong as it is as I progress in the inquiries and the investigation. In the melorhythmic, or even he's called it psychical balancing or something in his book, where he says that the instruments, especially the drums, both membrane drums and wooden drums, of course, he was making reference to the membrane drum, but this actually also applied to the log drums, that they are structured as male and female. And the male, it's always of what we would, if I get back to the concept I described, what we would describe as the tense sound, whereas the female is the mellow sound. And this interstructuring between the tense and the mellow sound is actually what determines the structuring or the cycle of a phrase, and not really as rhythmic accompaniment. So he paid attention mostly to an ensemble that was almost tuned in terms of the drum roll, tuned drum roll. However, his emphasis was not really related in other instruments that he considered as supportive. And it's quite interesting that these supportive instruments, which he didn't pay much attention to, is actually the foregrounded instrument in the genre I'm talking about. So it's kind of aligns to what he has said, and also a kind of an extension also, because most of the instruments he left out, the instruments that are mostly even misrepresented as being purely rhythmic. Of course, someone can argue that the drum is tuned, it can produce tones. But what about the woodblock? And what about the shaker and the other things? And these other instruments are also part of the ensembles he discussed, but his attention was more on the tuned drums. But I don't see his research as being in contrast with what I'm doing.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Chidi. This is Joshua. Great to see you. I would just want to echo what Jason said. I'm very excited about seeing where this is going. And I didn't realize to the extent that your research intersects with my interest on how timbre affects grouping and accent perception. So I'm curious, based off of your transcription, you put A as sort of quote unquote beat 2 of the measure, but you talked about how it could be beginning or ending. And I'm specifically interested, I think you've made an excellent case on how it is fundamentally timbral. There's a lot of dancing going on with this. And so I'm curious about how these moments, A, B, and C, affect how people are physically interacting with the music.
Okay, it actually, yes. There's one interesting thing about this ensemble is that it doesn't have a set of trained dancers that dance. The structure there is only the voices, the performance of the vocalists and the instrumentalists, and the dance or the dancing aspect is actually open, that you can dance as freestyle, I would say, but still following the pulse of the music. And the pulse, what we might describe as the pulse, or if we try to westernize it into a 4/4 time, we might call that the strong beat, corresponds with the point where the spectrum is richest. And this spectrum being the richest is not really enforced by how strongly the performers produce the rhythm, like strike the instrument, but the ambience of the entire orchestra, at which point it is the strongest. And it is at this point that reinforces the pulsation of the music and how the footwork or the dancing, if at all someone wants to dance to the music, which pulse he should use. And at this point, it is the point A, which is the biggest in the spectrum, that corresponds with the feet of the dancer. I don't know if that makes sense. All other points are actually perceived as a guide, a transition into this main point of the spectrum. I don't know if this makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. I think it's more of a question of when someone is dancing to it, are they hearing A? Are they more likely to hear A as beginning or ending? So are they stomping, it's leading into A, or does A serve as a launching off point?
And that's where a question of perception comes in. And for us to determine that, we might have to engage with the performers, the audience themselves, because I think at this point, the performers might understand the production of the music from a different way. I, as an audience or a dancer, if at all I want to dance, would understand it. So there is actually, for me, I don't think there is actually a beginning or an end, but once we understand that this is the point where you want to enter, that at that point where the person starts to engage with the music actually determines his relationship with all other sequences of the sound until he comes back to that same cycle. But the question of whether there is a beginning or an end, I think has to be determined by at what point someone joins and at what role the person is playing in relation to the music.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Chidi.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Bob, and thanks so much for founding me to give a presentation of my project. So today I'm talking about affective qualities of sustained instrumental blend. So we all know that emotional impacts are one of the greatest motivating factors for people to listen to music and to engage in music activities. And from the previous study, we know that timbre is a good carrier of emotion, like bright sound with happiness, dull sound with sadness, sharp sound with anger, and soft sound with both fear and tenderness. However, most of the studies have only focused on the timbre of individual instruments. But from our orchestration practices, we know that, for example, tuba and oboe, they can be combined and fused together into a blended new sound. And this new sound may have a new virtual timbre, which makes the effect of this become unknown and need to be investigated. So that's why we're working on how do we perceive the effect of instrumental blends. The research questions are divided into 3 parts. So the first part, we want to know, are listeners be able to perceive various effects from blends with different instrumental combinations? And does the music sophistication of listeners influence their perception? And does the degree of blend, as we know, the blend is not a no or all thing, it have degree of that. So does this influence the perceived effect? And also we want to know what exactly effects can be perceived from instrumental blends, and how do acoustic descriptors explain the perceived effects, and are there any differences between the effect of blended sound and individual sound? And also we want to know if there are a clear relationship between the effect of blend and those of its constituent instruments. So in this way, we designed 2 experiments to answer these questions. And we have 55 sound stimuli in total, which are 10 sustained sound, which are tuba, trombone, horn, trumpet, bassoon, clarinet, oboe, English horn, flute, and cello, in Vienna Symphony Library at PhD Shop 4 with duration 500 millisecond and dynamic as 40. And also we conducted loudness matching before they put into the experiment. And then these 10 sounds were paired with each other into 45 unison blended dyads. And we also conducted on-site synchronization with a couple of musicians to make the blend natural and better. So for the procedure, for the first experiment, 42 participants listened to all these 55 sound stimuli, and then they have to rate on each affect dimension for each sound, on what affect you think the sound is trying to express, such as from along the first dimension, tension from relaxed to tense, second energy, arousal from tired to awake, and valence from unpleasant to pleasant on 9-point continuous scale. And in the second experiment, 40 participants listened to only 45 blended dyads, and then they have to rate how well do the 2 sounds blend for the 45 sounds, from not blended at all to strongly blended. And also the Goldsmith Music Sophistication Index questionnaire was administered afterward for each participant, and the acoustic features of all the stimuli were calculated using the Timbre toolbox. So when we get this data, we did some analysis on that. So for the first part of question about the various effects on the music sophistication, we conducted ANCOVA on that, where the dependent variable is affect ratings and independent variable is a stimuli sound, and the covariate is the music sophistication. And for the degree of blend question, we're conducting correlation on that. So here the result. So here is the result of the ANCOVA. I only put the tension dimension here because it shared the same conclusion across the 3 dimensions. So here we can see that for the independent variable stimuli sound, and it's very significant, have large effective size, which means that blends with different combinations of instruments are useful to express different effects. And for the music sophistication covariate, we found it's not significant, which means that there is no significant difference in emotional perception between people with different degree of music sophistication. And as for degree of blend, we conducted Pearson's correlation between the degree of blend and each of the affect dimensions. And we found that the degree of blend is significantly but very weakly correlated with affect dimensions, would explain the variance is just 9.7 and 17.1%. Okay, for the second part of questions of the effects and acoustics and the differences of blend individual sounds, we conducted descriptive correlation and lasso and linear regression on that. So here is the correlation between each pair of the affect dimensions. And here we can see that the tension, arousal, and energy arousal are very highly positively correlated with each other. And we can also see that in the picture on the right, where axis is energy arousal, y-axis is tension arousal, and all the dots here are the sounds, where red dots are the blended sounds and the green dots are the individual sounds. So they're like lying with each other in a line here. And we can also see there is some relationship between the valence and tension arousal and energy arousal. We found valence is kind of relatively, but not that strong, negatively correlated with tension and energy, which means that usually if the sound be perceived as very high tension and energy arousal, sometimes it can be perceived as not that very high valence. Okay, so these are the other two plots of these three dimensions where we have valence as x-axis and energy arousal as y-axis for the left picture and tension arousal as y-axis for the right picture. We can hear some sound here to get to know what's happening for the sound. So here, this is the tuba flute sound where we have very positive valence, but low energy arousal and tension arousal. It sounds like this. And oh my God, the mouse. So here, this is trombone oboe pair, which we have very high tension and energy arousal, but low valence there, like this. And here is a trombone clarinet. Here we have like neutral valence and also middle of the energy and tension arousal, like this. And this is tuba oboe pair. We have like positive, kind of high valence, but like middle energy arousal. This, hope you get some idea of that. So we want to know more details to describe this dimension. So we conducted acoustic analysis on that, where we find that valence dimension is negatively correlative with effective duration, attack slope, and spectral variation, which means that if the sound have very slow attack and less variation in the spectrum, usually be perceived as positive and high valence there. And for energy arousal and tension arousal, we find it's positively correlated with stimulus 3, spectral spread, spectral flatness, and actively correlated with attack time, which means that if the sound have very high energy in the high frequency part and have a richer sound and sharp attack, usually be perceived as high energy arousal and tension arousal. And I think maybe some of you have noticed some differences of the green dots, the individual sound, and the red dots, the blended sound. So I draw a circle here, and we found that when the individual sound blend into a blended sound, and we found there is overall shifting in the valence to the lower valence. So we think it may be because of the unfamiliarity of the blended sound. And when we look into each instrument, what I called affect profile here, where I put all the average ratings of their affect ratings for each instrument and all the pairs with this instruments for this, where, for example, we can see here, and this is a flute, and the patterned one bar here is the flute itself. It is a valence for flute, and this is tension for flute, and this is energy for flute. And other colored bars are all the combinations with flute inside. And also this is trombone with a similar thing with pattern 1 as itself. So except for the valence we have just talked about, for tension energy, we found like for the flute, it have very low tension and energy arousal itself. But when they blended with others, we found many of them like have higher energy arousal than itself before. Like maybe the blended sound make the sound like sharpen. And for the trombone, we found here itself have very high tension and energy arousal, but with the blended with others, maybe it soften the sound, so make it perceived as kind of relatively low tension and energy arousal than before. Okay, so for the third part of the question of the relationship between the blends of constituent instruments, we conducted a geometric analysis on that. So as we know that it is a three-dimensional affect model with tension, energy, and valence, so we can put the average rating of each sound as a dot into this three-dimensional space. And here is an example of the oboe itself, tuba, and the oboe-tuba blended sound affect here. So we can easily connect them, so there will be a shape here. So we want to know if there is a perceptual intermediateness, which means A equals to B, and or if there is perceptual linearity, which means A plus B equals to C here. It's just like it's not a triangle anymore. The oboe tuba will right on the line between oboe and tuba. So it's very clearly, if in this example, it doesn't have perceptual intermediateness because oboe tuba affect is very close to the affect of oboe, and it's not linear at all. And we also conducted bootstrapping to get more logistic results. So for all the 45 sounds, we found there are no perceptual linearity. All of them are triangles. And we found there are little perceptual intermediateness here. So we found there are two pairs. We have these features. Where's tuba, English horn? We can hear about that. This is tuba. And this is English horn. And here is a tuba English horn together. I hope you think that is intermediateness of both of them. And also we found the trombone and the cello have the similar perceptual intermediateness. And this means that the perceptual distance of the affect from the blended sound to both constituent sound are equal. And it also means that the rest of 43 pairs, they're not intermediates, they have dominance there. For example, as we talk about oboe and oboe tuba pair here, oboe is very dominant in the affect of oboe and tuba. Okay, so let's put everything together. So we found that in our study, listeners' level of music sophistication does not significantly affect perceived emotions, and blends with different combinations of instruments are useful to express different affects. And also we found degree of blend, unfortunately, doesn't have a clear and direct relation with affect dimensions. And also we know that the motion of blends can be different from those of its constituent individual instrument sounds. And the overall valence of blends may be lower than individual instruments because of unfamiliarity. And individual instruments with lower arousal may tend to increase arousal after blending with other instruments. And if the sounds with high arousal itself may tend to decrease arousal after blend with other instruments. And also we found when two instruments blend, they may have different contributions to the perceived affect. Some instruments can be very dominant in the affect of blended sounds. In conclusion, we know that like timbral blends is not just a sound of 500 milliseconds, but it have a very big music background, music context inside. But I think this study do attest to the importance of timbral and orchestration features in conveying emotions. And we hope this can provide some help in orchestration studies and practice in our actor cohort, and more complex blend like compositive sound and sustained sounds and other orchestration techniques will be investigated in the future. And here are the references. And thank you so much of that. And feel free to give any suggestions, questions on that.
We have about 5 minutes for questions after these talks. So please feel free to come up to the mic. Just check the mic. Okay, thank you. What do you do after
Okay, thank you. Wonderful, very, very interesting. You might know that Jisin Tilakan, my PhD student, has just handed in his thesis about blending of music instruments. So it might be interesting maybe to team up with him. He concentrated more on the acoustics part and on the source parameters and also on the perceptual aspect, but not on what you did. So it might be quite nice to complement with him.
Thank you so much. I'm very interested in that study.
Thank you.
Please feel free to
I
send
sent
me.
you his email contact.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yifan. I was really interested in that notion of dominance, that some instruments seem to have a larger impact than others on the affect. I was curious if you think that relates at all to the instruments that are considered, let's say, good or bad blenders. People will say clarinet blends well, maybe that has a smaller impact. Oboe blends badly, maybe it has a bigger one.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Yes, I do try to find a correlation with their good blenders or bad blenders with their whether it's dominant or not. I don't find a very clear relationship of that, but I do find some of the bad blenders, maybe because of their acoustic feature, like very high spectral centroid, very bright sound or sharp sound, they may be make more influence people to like perceive as sounds like way, but they're not a very clear relationship between the like degree of blend and the overall like dominant of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. On this dominance thing, I was wondering if so you had all instruments were playing at a forte dynamic level. What if if you had different levels between instruments to bring the dominance more towards another instrument? Do you think this would be like what would happen there?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So because for the experiment, they have time limited. We don't want like the participant to be very tired of that, but we still want them to listen to as many stimuli as possible. So we only try like 40 dynamic here. But as you said, that dynamic is very important, like factor for the blind. Like if like more brighter sounds became softer or less dynamic, it would be easier to blend with each other and to have different results on that. But it could be a future study on that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So I assume that we're talking here about a kind of preliminary probe into an interesting subject area. And I would just suggest that two forms of expansion that would be extremely informative and bring us more towards musical experience itself is if the samples were, let's say, 4 seconds instead of 1 or 5.
Yeah.
Because the development of affective response takes time.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that this takes that into consideration. The other thing is the issue of unison versus intervals. And if you began to use actual tempered musical intervals, which most music that you would
Yes.
study would use, I think that your results would be extremely more complicated
Yeah.
than they are when you're trying to deal with unison. So applaud the effort and suggest that there are important ways in which this could move towards more, let's say, musical utility to
Mhm.
people who are pathetic composers like myself. You know.
Okay, thank you so much for the suggestion. Yeah, we will think about the intervals and also the length of the stimuli next step. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk. My name is Chel Sidlowski, and I'm a composer and pipe organist from Saskatchewan. I actually did my undergrad here, so I have very fond memories of this hall. I'm currently finishing up a master's in composition and sound design at l'Université de Montréal with Caroline Traube and Pierre Michaud. And to get started, we'll begin with some general context on hyper instruments broadly. And then we'll get into a bit more of the weeds with my own approach to this vast subject. So the mission of my project is to explore the intersection of modern and ancient technology by interfacing the pipe organ and software with the aim of weaving new artistic and poetic expressions rooted in history with a lens to the future. Now, what is an instrument? What is a hyper instrument? And then what is an instrument? So I want to mention that hyper instrument, also known, I use the term augmented instrument interchangeably with hyper instrument. This is a recent topic of exploration, but it is rooted in the long arc of instrument design broadly. We've always been asking questions of what our instruments can be, how they can help us to express ourselves. And so where hyper instruments sort of diverge from that tradition is that we attempt here to integrate digital technologies with our traditional instruments. And this is a very vast pluralistic field, but there will generally be two components. There will be an input side and an output side. And on the input side, we have the interface itself, sort of gathering data in various ways. And then on the output side, we have, what do we do with that data? And this term was coined by Todd Mackover at MIT in the 1980s. And so, as I mentioned, there are near infinite variety of approaches, but I'll name a few of them here. So gesture trackers have been used a lot. Air pressure sensitivity sensors are also really useful for wind instruments, etc. And then on the treatment side, we have live effects using a microphone, synthesis, and then also triggering of sound files that can be longer files or shorter files. And I want to make a special mention here that the proper term really is l'instrument augmenté and not l'instrument amélioré, because with each emphasizing of a aspect or a parameter of our instrument, something will always be inevitably lost. So this aesthetic prioritization is inherently personal, and it'll be dependent both on the instrument in question and then also on the person or the persons performing this investigation. So in terms of personal approaches, I'll give you guys an idea of my own. First of all, the constraining factor. As of July 2022, I've had the privilege of being pipe organist at l'Église Saint-Édouard in Montreal. And so I have access to this very beautiful 1913 Cassavant Frères pipe organ in the symphonic tradition. Got 3 keyboards, over 3,000 pipes, and a lot of history. In terms of my own aesthetic priorities, I had a number of them in mind when I was pursuing this research. So first of all, I really wanted what I was doing to integrate with the already established sound world of the pipe organ. And then I wanted to find ways to move past this, to extend this sound world. I wanted to use both convergent and divergent mappings. And ultimately, I wanted to be able to navigate between more acoustic sound profiles and more artificial spaces. So there would be an infinite amount of approaches, but I personally chose a trimodal approach. So it starts with synthesis here. That's kind of the main thrust of the project. Then I also have a microphone deep inside the organ where I apply various real-time effects. And then lastly, I've got a acousmatic element where I'm triggering some pre-recorded samples. So Organ Lab is software that I've been working on for the last couple years in Python, which allows me to synthesize sounds. And it begins with spectral analysis. So I've taken some audio recordings of various stops of the pipe organ, and then I try to use a rough approach with different methods to come up with emulations of these different stops. So using mainly additive, subtractive, and frequency modulation. And then the sort of fun part is I can do all kinds of crazy stuff with this that you could never do with a traditional instrument. So I can interpolate between pitches, I can interpolate between stops themselves, I can use inharmonic sounds. In the graphic spectrum there, you kind of see every second partial is actually moving in contrary motion. So you can kind of take the spectral profile and explode it, contract it, all kinds of stuff. And that's on GitHub if you want to check that out or help me clean up my code. And here's me at the interface. You see I've got a MIDI keyboard off to the side, which allows me to control the synthesis module, which is hooked up to my laptop here running Organ Lab. I'm also using Ableton Live for the live effects. And then here's actually a bird's eye view of the church itself. So you see, it's a little hard to see on this screen, but basically at the edge of the organ, there's a microphone deep inside the instrument itself. And then you've got 5 speakers creating a diffusion network in the church. So this is a piece, Élégie, where I've been putting some of this research into practice. It started as a set of etudes for hyperorgan, and it's largely inspired by the Duino Elegies of Rainer Maria Rilke, a set of poetry that has inspired me deeply. And it constitutes an extended practice. So I make reference to the various sonic iconography of the church, the bells, keys, doors, etc. And then, as I mentioned, I have a diffusion network. So I'm trying to explore this space in its entirety as much as possible. And then there's also some theatrical elements. I try to integrate and contrast my voice with the instrument. And so I'm gonna show you guys 2 excerpts of the video. The first one's gonna be focused more on the synthesis side, and then the second one more on the live effect side. Okay, and then for the live effects. So in conclusion, the pipe organ is not only an instrument, c'est un lieu. It is a shared space of cultural and historical importance, and it deserves to be explored thoroughly. Thank you for listening.
Well, again, we have time for one or two questions.
Thank you so much for this really interesting presentation. So my question is, I'm wondering how much of a role does the acoustics of this specific church play in all of the design? In other words, do you see this as a site-specific project?
It's definitely, for the moment, it's very site-specific. I have probably 300 feet of XLR cable routed through the church, trying to hook up all these different speakers and all of this. So for the moment, it is very site specific. I'm thinking about how I could potentially translate this piece or other pieces like it to different spaces. But I mean, the pipe organ itself is so modular and so varied from instrument to instrument, and then the space itself, similar case. So I think it's one of those things where you'd kind of have to approach it in a unique way for each context.
Yeah, hi, thank you for this presentation. I'm interested in what was the the steps of deciding where the speakers go in relation to the bells, and if you're interested in a compound sound, or if you're okay with I don't know, if the constraints of placement make that the electronic sound is elsewhere. I mean, the space does a lot, but probably also diffusion and projection play a role in merging the two. And I wonder if that was also something that you played with, or that you were able to play with, given the constraints.
So initially I wasn't planning on exploring the space in that way at all. I had one speaker beside the organ, and thought that was enough. And then actually it was my director Pierre Michaud that said, well, what if you play with the space a little bit? And so it developed gradually. What I kind of ended up with was having the sound. Anything that's synthesis is coming from only one speaker, the speaker beside the pipe organ. I wanted to create a kind of integrated sound, you know, something where the synthesis and the sound of the pipe organ itself are coming from the same place. And then anything that's effect, so you hear the echo and the distortion, that's coming from across the way. So I'm in the north transept with the organ. The effect speaker is in the south transept. So it creates a sort of antiphony where you're hearing the effects from the other side. And then there's two speakers that are just the house speaker, and that's just sort of to give a little bit more fullness. And then in the back, I actually have a Bluetooth speaker, which is, so the history of this organ is that it originally was placed back in the West Gallery where organs typically are. It was taken down in the 1950s with the in mind of being sold. And luckily it was never sold. And new administration found it in the basement and relocated it where it is today in the north transept. So I wanted to kind of represent this phantom organ. And so I placed a Bluetooth speaker up there. I had somebody working that. And so actually in the middle of the piece, there's this very fragile sound that comes from the back of the church. And there's also a flashlight that just gets aimed up towards the ceiling there. So yeah, I definitely tried to explore the space in different ways, and that's what I came up with.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle.
You're very welcome. Thanks, everyone.